Okay, so real quick, this very first slide, you can see a really big logo in the middle. So I just want to explain a little bit about who I am and who I work for. So I am the Aspen Cat Services Manager, and what I do is I manage a union catalog that's based in Colorado, a mix of
Bob, I think we just lost you. Wonder maybe if you're. And Bob, I think we may have lost your audio. I'm still showing you connected, and I don't know maybe if there is. I know on my cord I can often mute myself by hitting my hip on it. So I don't know if that is the case. Oh, enable microphone, make presenter. Okay, it looks like Bob lost a little bit of internet, so I think we have him back. Bob, do you want to give it a try?
yeah, I am back. Hopefully you can hear me.
Okay, and can
Yes.
everybody else hear Bob okay?
So I specifically scheduled this for a time I was up in the Click office to avoid internet issues because I live in a very small town with bad internet, and of course that just blew up in my face, but that's all right. Anyway, I was just talking a little bit about Click and how we are known for the courier, but other things as well, including the union catalog of Aspen Cat, which I manage. So I think we can move on from that. So the title of this is Collection Management Data, Quick and Easy, and I'm going to really focus on just one small aspect of collection management, and that's going to be that data piece. And mostly I'm going to be covering just some general thoughts about what data is and how you might think about it, and look at a particular tool that was developed that's basically just on a spreadsheet. It's got a lot of nice little equations on the backside that you can just input uh, data in, and I'll show you what that is. And that kind of gives you some interpretive results that might inform whether you weed, whether you need to buy more of this or that. Um, so that's basically what we're going to be doing. But the key is this doesn't take a huge time investment to pull some numbers, to throw them in a spreadsheet, and then have it spit out some results for you that you can then use. So I'm going to start on the purchasing side and ask, and you can just fill this in the chat box. Why would anybody use data when considering purchasing materials? I've got some ideas that I'm going to share with you, but I'm hoping you can tell me why you think that might be. And I can see folks are typing, so we will await their ideas. Now, as people are okay, here we go. So you don't spend money things people aren't checking out. That's a pretty good one. Return on investment, make sure communities get the best return on their tax dollars because we use data to inform nearly anything I'm spending money and time on. Yeah, so a lot of this has to do with you have a limited budget, and that budget needs to go far. So you don't want to be spending money on things that aren't necessary. Here's a couple other ones. Uh, Assess customer needs. Keep own biases out of purchasing. Yeah, that's a good one too. If it were me just purchasing the stuff I liked for a library, you would not have a very diverse collection. There'd be like books about like baseball and science fiction and not a lot else. So you don't want me just doing it based on exactly uh, what I'm into or anything like that. And obviously, librarians don't do that, but there are some unconscious biases. So here's what I came up with: a few things. Knowing what's popular and what is not. You might think that something's popular because you happen to be at the checkout desk when it circulated a few times, but if you actually look at the numbers, maybe it's not as popular as you think. Create a balanced collection. That gets at the point that I was talking about biases that somebody raised. Uh, Not just in content, but type of materials as well. Okay, anticipate what needs to be weeded. So obviously, the purchasing is one side of collection management, but knowing what needs to go is important too. And some things, when you purchase them, they were the exact right thing you needed to purchase. But over time, that may not be as necessary, and it might be time to clear the shelves for those new items. And then budget ahead of time by forecasting trends. If you kind of know what your community is into because you're looking at that data and you're starting to see all of a sudden uh, uh, Westerns forever had been a real popular thing in your community, but all of a sudden they just stopped checking out. Maybe you need to reallocate that budget to something that is a little bit more hot for the time. And as you stay on top of it, you can make those adjustments pretty easily on the fly by looking at those numbers. And then a lot of people I have talked to as I visit libraries spend a lot of time trying to figure out what patrons want, but they don't know. So maybe they're asking them questions, and that's good. You should talk to your patrons. Not going to say that you shouldn't do that, but that's an anecdotal piece of evidence. Should be backed up as well with what the actual numbers are saying. So you have a good sense of what's going on, because maybe the people that aren't talking to you are checking out a lot of things too. So those are all things to consider. My next question might be a little bit broader, might be a little tougher, is when does data fail? Maybe somebody has an example of when they were misled by a piece of data. So I'll let you guys, again, type in the chat box. You came up with some good stuff for the last question, so I know you'll come up with some good ideas now. We only have data on those who check out items. What we don't have, the data, the people who don't check out what they were like. So that's a great point. A lot of times in libraries, we actually do a pretty good job of knowing a lot about the people who come through the door. But there are other community members that may be interested in using the library. And maybe one of the reasons they don't is because we don't offer the services or the materials that they're interested in. So that's a great point. Data can fail when you apply the same collection trends across the entire library system. Yeah, different communities are different, and they have different needs. With AspenCat, I work with libraries in every corner of the state, and something that's really popular in Mancus may be very different in Burlington. Just those are two different corners of the state. They have a very different population, so that's a great example. Items that are only used in-house aren't in search sets, so that deals with collecting data. That is a potential issue for sure. Sometimes high usage data is only reflecting usage by a couple of people, not broad usage. So that's where data can be skewed. A couple of users can be heavy users, and that may be misleading. Absolutely, these are all really good ideas. People are still typing, so I'll revisit that, but I'm going to go ahead and do some of my examples. So a poor metric, and I'm only going to use one baseball focus example, I promise. The rest are going to be libraries. But so the save is a baseball stat, and a brief explainer, as brief as possible, is that basically if you pitch the last inning of a game, you're a relief pitcher coming in, and you give up less than 3 runs and maintain the win, you get is what is called a save. If you think about it, if you give up 3 runs in an inning, you didn't pitch very well. So this save exists. It was created by a sports writer, not a statistician, and it really a lot of people get paid based on how many saves they have. There's a lot of decisions made in how relief pitchers are valued based on the stat that doesn't actually do a very good job of indicating quality. So if you're thinking about that in the library, there was the example of, somebody had an example earlier that kind of touched on this, and that's like you might be not getting good data in because you have stuff that's being used in-house, that was the example, and it's not being reflected in your search stats. So it's getting used, but your stat doesn't account for all the possibilities, so that's not great. Next, badly collected data. So I thought of if your door count all of a sudden stops working for a couple hours in the day, you still get data out of that, and then you're evaluating at the end of it, and all of a sudden the numbers just don't look good. So that could be one issue that could happen in a library that will make that data not as accurate as you intend. Bad extrapolation of data. So at one organization I worked for, we did reference stats pretty weekly, and it was a lot of effort and all that. But I think at the end of the day, when you average it all out, you got some pretty good numbers from that. And then they started to say, you know what, we're going to get better data if we do this a lot less. And that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because what you're doing is you're then extrapolating. So you're saying, I'm going to do my reference stats at this one time, but I'm going to project that out for an entire year's worth. So most people don't do reference stats just once a year, but if you think about it and you just do it on a Wednesday, and that's the only time you do it, how does that compare to Sunday when maybe you're probably a little bit more busy? You're extrapolating this out, and when you do an extrapolation, there is a point where you can get really good results out, but the less data you put in, the more margin of error there is. Then there's incorrect assumptions, which I think is a big one. So you have low circulation for a collection, and we'll see that in the data. You might, when we're filling out this data tool and getting out numbers, you should not necessarily assume that just because the spreadsheet is saying you should weed this, that's actually the right answer. Because there's a lot of variables going on, and unless you can isolate them, you might have a bit of a problem with getting an accurate assumption. So in the case I brought, you got a collection that's low circing. What if it's low circing not because people want something in that collection, but the materials aren't of a high quality? So it's the right topic, but maybe not the right materials. Or let's say you've got this little nook in your library where all the large print is hidden. Well, maybe it's the fact that nobody can find it. Those are external factors that the data won't tell you. You have to think through this stuff because it might not just be the fact that you've bought too much. Okay, moving on. I'm going to show you what, well, first of all, I want to give credit to Chris Ripple, who created this tool we're going to be looking at. And you can see he's from the Central Kansas Library System, now retired. And then the guy I got it for, Patrick Bodley from the basically the Idaho State Library, he made some additions, and it is a Creative Commons. So this thing is out there for use, reuse, allowing it to be modified and all that stuff. So it is out there for consumption. The next thing I wanted to show, this is kind of the bottom of the spreadsheet. There are 4 pieces to it to what I created for our Aspen Cat libraries. And the first one is the template that you use to enter the data. Then we have reports to use with something I added, and I'll cover that in a little bit. I also put in there some sample data, so if you're filling it out for the first time, you can kind of see what it might look like. Then going back to what Chris did, there were instructions on how to use it and how to interpret results. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, and this is what it looks like filled out. Now, you don't have to look at the particular details of this. I'll have other slides as we fill this out that will blow this stuff up. And as Christine says, there is a link at the very end that will allow you to download a clean copy of this. But from this, you can see these first 4 columns: collection names, collection size, circulation added to collection. That is all the data that you put in. Everything else that has this more gray tone is the math that's happening in the spreadsheet behind the scenes to put together some numbers that you can then interpret. And you can see there's some of this is in red, some of it's in green. And we'll go into more detail, but you can tell that's just trying to tell you, should you buy more? Is it popular? Should you weed some because it's not popular? Going back to my previous point about data fails, that's where you don't want to necessarily take this as gospel. It's just a tool to give you an idea of what you should do. Okay, up next, I want to isolate this first column. These are going to be, I would probably recommend, you can either break this down by like a shelving location, maybe even a call number. Really depends on how your library is set up. But you can see from this example, they have things like audiobooks. I don't know what BBM is, but I do know ebooks. Fiction, kids' books. This is how this particular library broke this down. That's going to be totally up to how your library organizes things. There may be a lot more, there may be a lot less. Okay, in the instructions, and this is from the instructions, it will tell you that once you fill out this first part, then it's all about typing numbers into the columns. So collection size is what it sounds. It's a count of the numbers in that collection. Moving on to circulation, how much that circulated. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't say what time period that is. I would say I would look at least at a year of circulation data to start, but it's really the parameters that you want to set it at. And then added into the collection is the same type of thing. As long as that matches the circulation parameters for time, you're going to be okay. You don't want to say, well, we looked at the circulation for the past year, but we've added in the last 6 months these many items. That would definitely skew your results. Finally, these columns 4, 5, and 6 are automatically filled out. You won't have to touch them. That's why I said this is quick and easy. You're basically filling out 4 columns of data, and then you're getting some results that are filling out automatically. Okay, and then when we get into the recommendations period, it's further synthesizing those results from 4, 5, and 6 and then making some specific recommendations. Even to the point, if you look at column 9, it's suggesting suggesting how much you want to buy or weed. Or that actually happens in column 10 and 11. Does that mean that you want to weed exactly the amount of numbers that show up in column 10? No, I would definitely not recommend that. You're not automatons, you're librarians. Please bring your expertise to bear. It just kind of gives you a hint of a suggestion. Okay. Moving on, so the reports to use part, this is just something and this is not displaying super well, but what I did is I added a tab that had links, hyperlinks to the particular reports. AspenCat uses Koha, which is web-based, and so I'm able to just create hyperlinks that you can get those reports out if you're using this. Your library system may vary. A lot of systems you're using are probably not web-based, but I can guarantee you that that libraries have reports of what their count is. If you're going to use shelving locations, that every library system has the ability to get that data out. Every library system can break down circulation by shelving location or item type or call number if you prefer to use those. And then finally, acquisitions items, you should be able to do that in a date range. If you're not the person at your library or your library system that runs those reports, all you have to do is just talk to whomever does, and they can provide you that data pretty easily. Okay, so this is what it looks like blank. And I'm going to start filling this out. So as I start to fill this out, you're going to see some changes going on. The first one is it's going to give you a total right on the bottom, a running total. It's part of the wonderful magic of Excel. It just does the stuff for you. As I add all these other details out, that total will grow. And then on the right-hand column, you're going to start to see those percentages change. Until it's filled out, it's not worth looking at. Because you can tell right now, having 99.57% of the collection books on the CD is not how it's going to end up. So it will continue to change as we go through this. So here's what it looks like. And this is some slightly modified sample data I used from an AspenCat library. And I wanted to use actual data from a library because there's some interesting stuff that kind of pops up when we look at it this way. So these are all the percentages that pop out. Let me just ask you this. Is there anything that jumps out as kind of odd about this distribution on just collection size? Only 3 junior fiction, only 2 Blu-rays. Yeah, that's true. I don't quite know the juvenile fiction answer, but I can tell you on the Blu-ray, we just started adding that as a shelving location that can be used. But it could also be a library is for the first time buying a Blu-ray. So you're going to look at that, and a year from now, maybe you only have 2 right now, but a year from that, you might have a larger collection. So you start to look at that and go, maybe that number's not right. Another thing, maybe this juvenile fiction is miscategorized. That's an important thing to be mindful of as well. Okay, so we're a little further along here. I started to fill out circulation data, and you're starting to see more numbers come up here. So you're starting to see percentage of total circulation, and then it's starting to give these things that are in green, that are highlighted. Again, this is not complete, so you definitely don't want to, until it's all entered, there's not a lot that you're going to learn from this. Okay, so I've got this all filled out now, and we've got, we've actually got some numbers that look a little bit better. I'm going to ask you right now again, what jumps out if we want to look at this column all the way to the right, that jumps out at you. Should be somewhat obvious because it is color coded. And that's the point of the color coding system. Saw somebody typing. Some very detailed descriptions being written about what's going on. Need to take a look at their 500 and 600 Deweys. Okay. Yeah, I would point to the fact that the nonfiction, for whatever reason, is not circulating relative to everything else. But if you look at the DVDs that have the green, they're circulating a lot. Now, here's a pro tip. I've not been to a library that circulates, a public library that circulates DVDs that doesn't have a big green number there. Turns out those are very popular. Also wanted to, yeah, we talked about juvenile fiction earlier. This is really weird. A collection size of 3, but circulation of 82? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm going to just make a wild guess here. I'd have to talk to the library, but they probably reclassified some things. That would be my guess there. But they left 3 of those. But so for some reason, those are the weird numbers I got. Now, if anything, and you're looking at this data and something like that jumps out, maybe you need to start from scratch, go back to the data and figure out something. Maybe juvenile fiction needs to be grouped into something else. Maybe you put it together with picture books and just call it a children's collection, that sort of thing. All depends on what kind of data is being put out there. Okay, so we've got this filled out with all these columns, and you got some pretty good data. The local history, 4 items, 0 checked out, so that's why there's some gaps there. Same with the juvenile fiction. It doesn't, there's not enough added for this to really make sense, but it's a low enough number that it's not statistically significant here. Okay, so now if I go to another part of the spreadsheet, when we start to get into those interpretive results, I'm going to ask again, is there anything as we look at these numbers that's jumping out to anybody? And since I kind of asked that already, I'll also ask, I've got a few questions for you. Is there something that you look at this that you feel strongly you should buy more or less of? Less magazines. So if we look at the magazine column, you're getting your 14.45%. That number is, fiction's a little low too, but that really jumps out as a number, as a potential problem there, that maybe those aren't circulating. Again, I will say less magazines is one interpretation of these results. You might need to buy better magazines. Maybe this tells you should do a survey of your patrons and see if there are other magazines that they want. The DVD number would really make the size of the collection jump if I actually purchased 700. Yeah, there's a reason why people generally don't have the budget to just jump their DVD collection by 700. And if you look at the total of recommended buy titles this year, that's almost half of what it's recommending. And that may not be in the budget, and that's just a reality. So that's a factor that, looking at the data, that none of this takes into account. So yeah, that is exactly why I find that these numbers are always so high for DVDs. Okay, I've got another question for you that kind of gets at some of the things I'm talking about. Maybe you guys have some ideas for alternate explanations in your library for why maybe let's look at fiction. So fiction's, it's saying buy fewer. Uh, it's still got a turnover rate of 2.3, so it's not high. It's just saying maybe pull it back a little bit. Um, what would you interpret that as? If you looked at this data and you've got a turnover rate of 2.3 for fiction, do you keep on doing the same thing or don't you? Not really any wrong answers here because you're looking at semi-fake data. And to answer Mary's question about this is an academic liberal arts library, it is a public library. Again, I kind of put together a few things in the data to make it work. So that's a great, so Emlyn asks, what's your turnover goal for each collection area? And I like the way that question is phrased because that may vary for each division, each collection. You might be okay with having a few more fiction books on the shelf that aren't turning over as quickly. Oh, what is turnover rate? Great question. Probably should explain that. So turnover rate is calculating column 2 divided by column 1. And if we go back and remember what those are, that is the circulation divided by the total titles. So basically this is saying, and I did this over a year, so I looked at, so over a year, what this is telling me is that fiction titles each average out, so each title averages out to check out 2.3 times in a given year. Whereas the DVDs are up to 6.6, picture books are 2. Thanks for that question. I did a poor job of explaining that. A lot of libraries do a basic turnover rate calculation just to get a sense of, a real quick sense of what they're buying versus what is checking out for a collection. This just does the math for you, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay. I see a couple other people typing, so I just want to wait for them. Another thing I'll point out here that I find a little odd is it's saying you should weed 476 titles but add 1,500. That doesn't sound like a great idea. If you want to have clear shelves, you may not have a policy where you weed one title per everything you buy, but you probably shouldn't have a 3-to-1 ratio of buying versus weeding. Maybe there's some attrition in there, so you don't have to weed because some stuff gets lost, some stuff doesn't come back. But I guarantee if you do this, you're going to have some pretty crammed shelves. So Don says, for the fiction, they might consider looking at what genres patrons are most interested in. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. If you're just looking at this and just going to the shelf and just indiscriminately pulling books off and reducing your budgets and that, you're falling into some of those traps we talked about towards the beginning of the presentation. There's a lot of variables that go into this, and you want to consider as many as possible before taking drastic action. Okay, well, that is the basic part of the tool. I've got my email address up here. If you have any further questions, somebody wants to run this and needs to brainstorm some ideas about how to interpret some of this data, I am happy to do that. I linked this to a pretty simple collection tool URL, so you could actually write it down, but it will come up in a Google sheet, and so on the upper right hand side there'll be an opportunity for you to download that sheet clean. So, but if anybody has any trouble with that, I do not mind emailing you the sheet. So, like I said, this is going to focus on a very particular part of collection management. I want to show you that this is a very easy thing to do. You don't need to have an advanced stats degree to use this. You don't need to be the reports expert in your library to use this. You just need to get out some pretty basic, pretty available data, plug in some numbers, and then this is going to give you something you can work with that gives you a sense of things. Now, we talked earlier about getting into content and those types of things. Um, that's where the art of being a librarian comes into. It's because fiction is a big topic, right? You have all sorts of different kinds of fiction that includes sci-fi. So maybe you want to break it down into more granular. You want to look at your sci-fi, how that's checking out versus your fantasy versus your classics. You can go that route. There's a lot of options to do with this. It's very customizable. Finally, we have part of this was done as a presentation at our the Click Spring workshops a couple years ago, and I just had a piece of it, and Sarah Wright, our assistant director, compiled some websites that you can use to actually get to the more art part. Where do you actually go to get these materials? Are you just going to Amazon, or do you have a list of vendors you go off of? Are you using reviews? So we've got some pretty obvious stuff that a lot of you probably already use with different providers, and they'll provide those lists as well. But there's also some options for getting these newsletters or online book reviews, annual award lists. All these things are things that we came up with as we did these sessions over the state, including the Colorado State Library Book Club resource. Point that out. But there's lots of things to get at that. What are the actual titles I buy? Because I'm not giving you any of that information. I'm just giving you a real broad look at these collections that can get somewhat granular, but aren't that don't get into the okay. Now I know I need to buy more fiction or more DVDs. Which ones do I buy? That's a whole nother ball of wax, and I am the wrong person to guide you down that path. That's for sure. Are there any other questions I can answer?
So while we are, like I said, you're welcome to ask questions about the tool. We also thought that if, as you're sort of, and I think you guys, and you can tell me if you're able to scroll up and down in this document, I will make this PDF available, but we were kind of curious what other, where do you guys go when it's time to actually do the ordering or to look and see what's available? We can always add places to this document that I can make available later. But if you have any questions for Bob about the actual tool, which I did link in the chat and I will make available when I post the archive later today on the CSL in Session website, please put those in chat because we have plenty of time for questions today.
Yeah, okay, so there's a question of how I made this available through AspenCat. The answer is, yeah, when I started working with this a couple years ago, I did send something out, so you can just put in a ticket and I will get you a clean version of that, or you can go, go through me because I've got a couple of those things with the reports linked that you're going to want to see, Kathy. So I will get you a copy with those links already in there. How can you know how granular to go? Does it save time to start thinking big and then only dive into a few places? The library example I use is not a big library, so getting too granular for that library would be overkill because they just don't have like shelves and shelves of just science fiction books, that sort of thing. So it really depends on your library. I tend to like more information if possible, but if you just want to, you can see this doesn't take a lot of time. So your idea of starting with a more big picture look, I think makes a lot of sense. So you could start with that. But if you're finding you're having those questions like, man, I really need to break up fiction. It's too big to just look at as one monolith. It's not giving me enough information. Then that'll guide you to start breaking it down a little bit further. And you could do both. It's just a matter of getting that data out, and that really should not be. Having seen a variety of different library systems, these reports, even to go a bit more granular, should be available in each of them. So maybe you want to look at the big picture on one hand, and then look at the more detailed piece. You could just run it just for fiction. You could have your big picture thing, and then you could break down just fiction and just use a new spreadsheet for that, just on that alone, and it'll still pump up all that data. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Cool. Anything else?
Are there any other questions about the tool or any other places that you would like to share where you actually go to see what's available, stay on top of kind of collection trends, those kinds of things?
I see Gina has been typing a lot, so I'm really interested to see what that
She
turns
may be
into.
taking personal notes too. Oh, fantastic
Oh, okay.
question. Yeah, cool. Thank you for that, Emmeline.
Yeah, and this is hardly an exhaustive list. It's pretty basic. You can get into some real narrow, again, to use the word granular, areas of content that are really specific for subgenres of subgenres that will be reviewed and all that. So there's a lot of information out there. Is the tool based on the percent of relative use? I'm not quite sure what you mean by relative use. How one collection demand compares to another. Well, where you're getting that demand is by the search stats, and that's how you're evaluating that. So it's possible that that's not a holistic view of what demand is. All the way back to the beginning, somebody pointed out that some materials, like say magazines that we saw weren't checking out a lot, might be being used a lot in the library. So that again, that doesn't mean you get rid of your magazines. So I'm sure I'm not exactly answering your question. But yeah, the metric for measuring demand is circulation over a period of time that you determine.
And I am making note of the places for recommendations that people are posting in chat, so we can get that added to this list as well when I post it on the CSL in Session website.
Now, I remember back from our session a while ago, one thing we talked about when we were talking about saving time is, and I don't want to, well, I'm going to use a specific example, but they're not the only one that does that, so I'm not throwing them under the bus. But there, you can do standing orders with a lot of vendors. That will save you time, but I would not recommend it, because whether it's like Junior Library Guild or even some of these big vendors, a lot of the times the stuff they send you is the stuff that isn't the most popular. They might throw a few of those in, but they're also clearing a lot of inventory for that they're not selling otherwise. It's kind of a real sweet deal for them, because they can get rid of their backlog of stuff that isn't being bought and sell it to you for near market price. So that is a time saver, but just observing it in a lot of libraries, those collections don't end up checking out a whole lot. Even if they look fancy and new and nice, they're not necessarily what is popular with patrons. So I would caution against trying to save time that way. It's a lot better to look at some data, get some of that anecdotal data from talking to patrons, and do your research by looking at some of these reviews and those type of things to make sure that you're getting high quality stuff that people actually want.
So, and if you guys continue to have questions or continue to have resources, go ahead and post them. But I did want to pull up a survey. This is a link to our CSL in session survey for today's session. So for those of you who may have to go, I'm also going to post it in the chat. We do always value your feedback, and you can let us know what you thought of today's session. Also, if you all need a survey, I'm going to type my, not a survey, a certificate for attending today's session. I'm going to type my email address in the chat box also here in just a second. Can't talk and type at the same time. And then I'll also post in the URL for CSL in session where the archive will be available later today. But we do still have about 10 minutes if you guys have more questions or thoughts that you want to
Yeah, and I'll just also add real quick that, oh, here's, okay, percentage of, okay, interesting. Okay, so yeah, looks like Amazon has a different tool. That's cool. Thanks, Gina. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Some of these calculations, we were talking about turnover rate earlier, aren't super complex equations, so they're just something you can do by hand as well. Um, but I just wanted to add that when you're doing this stuff, there is no way that every single piece of material you buy is going to be a home run, and that's okay. This is just a way to evaluate how you've been doing, maybe learn from mistakes, that sort of thing. There's a lot of other data ways to get into stuff too. Um, Whether it's just, I mean, some people will just go around, pull out each book off the shelf and or run a report that shows their inventory and just really look at what individual titles are checking out or not checking out, and maybe make some decisions on how to group those to make a decision of what else to purchase. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but nobody's going to do this perfectly, so don't aim for that.
All right. Last call for questions or thoughts. I'm going to bring back Bob's contact information as well in case you want to contact him offline. But if nobody else has any questions, I will go ahead and extend my thanks to Bob for sharing this information and for sharing the tool and kind of how to use it. Once again, the CSL in Session website, which is linked in the chat. I will be posting a link to the tool. I will be updating the PDF that has kind of a list of resources, including the ones that people have shared with us today. And the archived actual recording of today's session will be available. So if you want to go back and kind of review it when you have access to the tool alongside you, etc., it will be available. And I want to thank everybody for attending today and hearing about CSL in session. Our next CSL in session is going to be on Thursday, September 20th at noon Colorado time. Jean Heilig, a colleague of mine here at the State Library, will be facilitating a conversation on getting unstuck, the secret life of procrastinators. So hopefully you will join us for that one. So
thanks everybody.
Have a great afternoon.